November 17, 1944, northern Luzon, Philippines. The jungle breathed around him, thick, humid air pressing down like a living thing. Staff Sergeant Vernon Baker moved through the undergrowth with the careful silence of a man who understood that every sound could mean death. His uniform was torn, stained dark with sweat and blood that might have been his or might have belonged to the 3 men from his patrol who hadn't made it past the ambush 2 hours ago. The Pacific Theater in late 1944 was a grinding, brutal campaign where soldiers fought not just the enemy, but the terrain itself. Jungles so dense that men could pass within feet of each other and never know it. Heat that turned metal too hot to touch. Insects that spread disease as effectively as bullets spread death. Baker's unit had been conducting reconnaissance near Japanese positions when they'd stumbled into a kill zone. The firefight had been brief and catastrophic. Now Baker was alone, cut off from American lines, deep in territory the Japanese had held for 3 years. His rifle was gone, lost when he'd tumbled down a ravine during the retreat. He had a combat knife strapped to his leg, 2 grenades on his webbing, and the absolute certainty that if the Japanese found him, capture would be a prelude to execution, not imprisonment. The Japanese military's treatment of prisoners in the Philippines had become infamous. The Bataan Death March, the countless summary executions, the casual brutality toward anyone who surrendered. American soldiers had learned to fight until they couldn't fight anymore, and then to fight some more, because surrender meant torture and death, just slower and more humiliating than dying in combat. Baker knew all this as he pushed through the vegetation, trying to orient himself, looking for any landmark that might guide him back toward friendly lines. The jungle was a maze, every direction looking identical, every sound potentially hostile. Birds called overhead, or were those Japanese signals? Water dripped from leaves, or were those footsteps? The first indication he wasn't alone came not from sound, but from absence of sound. The jungle went quiet in a way that made his skin prickle. Birds stopped calling. Insects ceased their endless buzzing. In that sudden silence, Baker understood with absolute clarity that he was surrounded. They came from everywhere at once. Japanese soldiers materializing from the jungle like ghosts, rifles pointed, bayonets fixed. Baker's hand went instinctively to his knife, but the mathematics were clear. 20, 30, maybe more soldiers, all with weapons trained on him. Fighting would mean dying in seconds. Not fighting might mean living minutes longer, long enough perhaps for some miracle to present itself. He raised his hands slowly, the universal gesture of surrender. The Japanese soldiers closed in, maintaining their perimeter, weapons never wavering. An officer emerged from the circle, lean, hard-faced, wearing the insignia of a lieutenant. He barked orders in Japanese, and soldiers moved forward to search Baker, removing his knife, his grenades, his webbing, even his boots. They checked him for hidden weapons with brutal efficiency, fists and rifle butts, ensuring he carried nothing they might have missed. Baker was forced to his knees, hands behind his head. Around him, more Japanese soldiers appeared. The initial group had been just the capture team. Now the full force assembled, 50, maybe more, forming a loose circle in a small clearing. They were organized, professional, moving with the precision of experienced infantry. These weren't conscripts or garrison troops. These were frontline soldiers who'd been fighting Americans for months, who knew their business, who had performed this ritual before. The officer walked a slow circle around Baker, studying him with the detached interest of a man examining an insect. He spoke in broken English. American soldier. You are finished. War for you is complete. Baker said nothing. What could he say? Bleeding wouldn't help. These soldiers had been taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, and they viewed American prisoners with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. Defiance would just earn a quicker death. So he knelt there in silence, his mind racing through possibilities, calculating odds, looking for any angle, any opening, any chance. The officer gestured, and soldiers moved to form the execution detail properly. This wasn't going to be a quick bullet to the head. This was going to be a display, a lesson, perhaps a form of entertainment for troops who'd been in the jungle too long. Some of the soldiers were laughing quietly among themselves. Others watched with blank faces, the war having burned away whatever capacity for empathy they'd once possessed. Baker's hands were forced down to his sides. 2 soldiers stood directly behind him, rifles pointed at his back. The officer drew his pistol, an American-made .45, probably taken from some earlier prisoner or battlefield casualty. He checked the magazine with deliberate slowness, ensuring Baker saw that it was loaded, that death was coming, that there was no last-minute reprieve possible. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt with a gun pointed at his head and 54 enemy soldiers surrounding him, Vernon Baker made a decision that would define the next 7 minutes and guarantee his place in the impossible annals of combat history. He decided he wasn't going to die quietly. The jungle had gone silent around them, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when one man faced his execution and chose, instead of acceptance, absolute violence. The Japanese officer moved with ceremonial precision, each gesture calculated for maximum psychological impact. He positioned himself directly in front of Baker, close enough that the American could see the weathering on his uniform, the dirt under his fingernails, the small scar that ran along his jawline. This proximity was intentional. The condemned man should see his executioner's face, should understand that his death was personal, witnessed, acknowledged. Around the clearing's perimeter, the 54 Japanese soldiers had arranged themselves in a loose formation that served multiple purposes. It was a viewing gallery, allowing all present to witness the execution. It was a security perimeter, preventing any escape attempt. And it was a display of force, a demonstration that Japanese military power was absolute, that American soldiers who ventured into this territory would meet this fate. Some of the soldiers were veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, men who'd fought at Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the countless unnamed jungle battles that had ground down both armies. Their faces showed the characteristic emptiness that came from seeing too much death, from participating in too much killing. They watched Baker with professional interest, noting how he held himself, whether he would beg or maintain dignity, whether he understood what was about to happen. Others were younger, newer to combat, and their faces showed different emotions, curiosity, anticipation, perhaps even a trace of discomfort. They had been taught that Americans were soft, weak, that they crumbled under pressure and begged for mercy. They watched to see if their training had been correct, if this American would break, if the propaganda about Western weakness would be confirmed. The officer spoke again, this time in Japanese, addressing his men rather than the prisoner. His words carried the formal cadence of ritual speech. This was not conversation, but ceremony. He was explaining, Baker realized, the reason for the execution, the military justice being dispensed, the example being made. The soldiers listened with varying degrees of attention, some nodding, others simply staring ahead with the blank expressions of men who had witnessed this before and would witness it again. Then the officer switched back to broken English, apparently wanting Baker to understand his final moments. You are soldier. You fight. This is war. War have ending. For you, ending is now. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was something colder, a statement of fact, an acknowledgement that they were all participants in a system where death was currency and survival was temporary. The officer wasn't gloating. He was simply narrating reality. Baker remained silent, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. His eyes tracked movement around the clearing, cataloging positions, noting which soldiers were alert and which were distracted, which weapons were held ready and which were slung casually. He was assessing, calculating, doing what soldiers do when faced with impossible odds, looking for the one chance in 1,000 that might allow survival. The officer holstered his pistol. Baker's heart lurched, thinking execution was delayed, but then drew his sword instead. The blade caught sunlight filtering through the jungle canopy, and several soldiers straightened, understanding that this would be a traditional execution. The officer took a practice swing, testing the blade's weight and balance, ensuring the strike would be clean. This was worse than a bullet. A bullet was quick, impersonal, mechanical. The sword meant the officer would have to step close, would have to physically deliver death, would need to be within arm's reach to complete the execution. It meant Baker would see the blade coming, would have time, seconds, but time, to experience his death rather than simply ceasing to exist between one heartbeat and the next. The soldiers watching understood the significance. Some nodded in approval. This was a proper execution, one that honored the warrior tradition even as it ended an enemy's life. Others remained impassive, having seen enough death that the method no longer mattered. A few shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing that this personal, intimate killing was harder to witness than the distant impersonality of combat. The officer raised his sword, positioning himself for the strike. He would approach from the side, the blade would descend in a precise arc, and if his technique was good, which it appeared to be, Baker's suffering would be minimal. One strike, clean and fast, and another American soldier would become a statistic in a war that consumed men by the thousands. But the officer made his first mistake. He stepped too close. In his desire for a perfect execution angle, in his focus on technique and ceremony, he moved into the range where a desperate man might attempt something suicidal. He was 3 feet away, well within lunging distance, his sword raised but not yet beginning its descent. For a crucial second, he was committed to his strike, his weight forward, his attention divided between his blade and his target. Baker saw it, the opening, the angle, the one chance that probability offered. His mind, operating at combat speed where seconds stretch into hours and every detail becomes crystalline, calculated the mathematics of violence. The officer's .45 pistol was was still in its holster, accessible, loaded with 7 rounds. The nearest soldiers were 5 feet away, their rifles pointed generally toward him, but not immediately ready to fire. The officer was focused on his sword strike, not on defending himself. One chance, one move, and if it failed, he would die perhaps 3 seconds faster than he was going to die anyway. Vernon Baker, kneeling in the dirt of a Philippine jungle clearing, surrounded by 54 enemy soldiers, watching a sword being raised to kill him, made his decision in the fraction of a second that separates thought from action. He exploded upward and forward, his legs driving him into the officer with all the force his exhausted body could generate, his right hand already reaching for the pistol holster as his shoulder crashed into the officer's chest. The jungle's silence shattered, time fragmented into disconnected moments of violent clarity. Baker's shoulder hit the Japanese officer's sternum with enough force to lift the man off his feet. The officer's sword swing, already committed, went wide, the blade cutting empty air where Baker's neck had been a heartbeat before. They fell together, Baker's momentum carrying them both to the ground, his right hand finding the pistol grip and his finger the holster's thumb break in one fluid motion born from 1,000 hours of training. The pistol came free as they hit the dirt. The officer, winded from the impact, was trying to bring his sword back around, trying to regain control of a situation that had gone from ceremonial execution to life or death struggle in less than a second. But Baker's hand was already moving, the pistol rising, the muzzle finding its target with the automatic certainty of muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The shot was muffled, pressed against the officer's body. The sound was absorbed by cloth and flesh, but its effect was immediate and catastrophic. The officer's body went rigid, then limp, the sword clattering from his fingers. Baker felt the man die under him, felt the exact moment when struggle became stillness. For a frozen instant that probably lasted less than a second but felt eternal, nobody moved. The 53 remaining Japanese soldiers stared at the impossible sight of their officer dead on the ground, and the condemned prisoner suddenly armed and dangerous. Their training had prepared them for many scenarios. Prisoner attempts to escape, prisoner attempts to grab weapons, prisoner resistance during capture. But this, a prisoner successfully killing his executioner in the middle of a 53-man security detail, this was outside their experience, outside their expectations, outside the realm of scenarios they had drilled for. That instant of shock paralysis was Baker's only advantage, and he used it. He rolled off the dead officer, his left hand already reaching for the sword while his right kept the pistol oriented toward threats. He came up in a crouch, the pistol tracking, finding the nearest soldier, a young private whose rifle was still pointed at the ground, his face showing pure shock, and fired. The private went down. Now the paralysis broke. 52 soldiers began reacting simultaneously, reaching for weapons, bringing rifles to bear, shouting orders and warnings, and simply shouting from adrenaline and fear. But they were reacting in a confined space, in a clearing barely 30 feet across, surrounded by jungle vegetation that limited movement and channeled approaches. And they were reacting to a situation none of them had trained for, while Baker was operating on pure survival instinct, the most powerful motivator in human experience. He moved laterally, toward the edge of the clearing, firing as he moved. The .45 bucked in his hand. 3 shots, 3 more soldiers down or wounded. He reached a fallen soldier's rifle, scooped it up left-handed without breaking stride, kept moving. A bullet cracked past his head, so close he felt the pressure wave. Another hit the ground, where he'd been standing a second before. The Japanese soldiers were firing now, but firing in near panic, their shots wild, hitting trees and ground and, inevitably, each other. In the chaos and confusion, with a target moving fast and soldiers surrounding the clearing in a circle, crossfire became a mathematical certainty. Baker heard screams as friendly fire found targets, heard officers shouting for ceasefire, trying to impose order on chaos. He dropped behind a fallen log at the clearing's edge, the officer's pistol in one hand and a captured rifle in the other. His breath came in ragged gasps. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat, but his hands were steady, his vision was clear, and his mind was operating with the hyper-focused clarity that combat brings to some men. The ability to process information faster than thought, to react before conscious decision, to survive by being faster and more vicious than the men trying to kill you. A soldier appeared around the log's end, bayonet fixed, charging. Baker shot him with the rifle at point-blank range. Another came from the left, and Baker twisted, firing the .45 twice into center mass. The soldier fell. 5, 6. The clearing had become a killing ground, but the geometry was wrong for the Japanese. They had superior numbers, but in the confined space with jungle-limiting maneuver, and Baker positioned at the perimeter where he could use vegetation for cover, their advantage was neutralized. They couldn't bring their full force to bear simultaneously. They had to come at him through narrow approaches, channeled by terrain, terrain, and Baker was killing anyone who came close enough to threaten him. He had no plan beyond survival, no strategy except violence, no goal except making it to the next second, then the next, then the next. This was combat at its most primitive. Two sides trying to kill each other, all civilization stripped away, nothing remaining except the will to live and the willingness to kill. 7, 8, 9. The officer's pistol ran dry. Baker dropped it, picked up another rifle from a dead soldier, kept firing. His world had narrowed to target acquisition, see movement, shoot movement, shift to next movement. Some part of his mind noted that the Japanese were trying to organize, that an ENCO was shouting orders, attempting to establish fire discipline and coordinate an assault. That part of Baker's mind identified the ENCO as a priority target. He aimed carefully, took a breath, squeezed the trigger. The ENCO went down. 10. The battle devolved into something primal and terrible, a kind of combat that military manuals don't adequately describe because it exists at the boundary between tactics and pure savagery. Baker had no fire and maneuver plan, no concept of fields of fire or tactical withdrawal. He simply killed anyone who came close enough to threaten him, using whatever weapon was available. Moving when staying still meant death, fighting with the desperate efficiency of a cornered predator. The Japanese soldiers, trained and experienced though they were, found themselves in a nightmare scenario. Their numerical advantage meant nothing in the close terrain. Their coordination fell apart as officers died, and NCOs couldn't maintain control amid the chaos. They were fighting an enemy who had nothing to lose, who moved with the frantic unpredictability of desperation, who killed with a speed and brutality that matched their own reputation for ferocity. Minute 2, Baker had circled halfway around the clearing's perimeter, staying in the thick vegetation, using trees for cover, constantly moving. He picked up a grenade from a dead soldier's webbing, pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, threw it toward a cluster of soldiers trying to establish a firing position. The explosion sent shrapnel in every direction, and more screams joined the cacophony. 15, 16, 17. A soldier burst through the undergrowth directly in front of him, too close for firearms. Baker dropped his rifle and drew the officer's sword, still gripped in his left hand since he'd picked it up 90 seconds ago. The blade felt awkward, unfamiliar, but Baker swung it with the same desperate violence he'd brought to everything else, and the soldier went down. 18. Minute 3, the Japanese were trying to establish a perimeter, to create overlapping fields of fire that would trap Baker wherever he moved. But the jungle terrain defeated their efforts. Visibility was measured in yards, sound was muffled by vegetation, and Baker kept moving, never staying in one position long enough for them to coordinate fire on his location. He found himself near 2 soldiers who were reloading simultaneously, their attention on their weapons rather than their surroundings. Baker shot them both before they could react. 20. 21. Another soldier appeared, this one carrying a Type 99 light machine gun, a weapon that could end this fight in seconds if the gunner got set up and acquired Baker as a target. Baker recognized the threat instantly, understood that the machine gun had to be neutralized immediately. He charged directly at the gunner, firing his rifle from the hip, closing the distance before the machine gunner could bring the weapon to bear. They collided physically, both men dropping their guns, fighting hand to hand in the mud and leaves. The soldier was strong, well trained in close combat, but Baker was fighting for his life with an intensity that overcame technique. He got his thumbs into the man's eyes, felt the soldier scream and spasm, then grabbed a rock and bashed the man's skull until the struggling stopped. 22. Minute 4. Baker's body was operating on pure adrenaline, beyond exhaustion into that strange state where pain and fatigue become background noise overridden by the imperative of survival. He had wounds he didn't remember receiving, his left arm was bleeding from a bayonet cut, his face had been grazed by a bullet or shrapnel, his hands were torn and bruised. None of it mattered. He retrieved the machine gun, discovered it was undamaged, and turned it on a group of soldiers attempting to flank his position. The weapon chattered briefly before jamming, possibly damaged in the fall, but those few seconds of fire dropped 3 more soldiers and sent the others scattering. 25, 26, 27. Minute 5. The Japanese were pulling back, creating distance, trying to establish fields of fire at range where their numbers would matter. Baker recognized the shift in tactics, understood that if they succeeded in pinning him down from multiple directions, he was finished. He had to keep moving, keep them reacting, prevent them from organizing. He launched himself forward into the clearing, firing a captured rifle in short bursts, running directly at the nearest group of soldiers. The insanity of the charge froze them momentarily. Nobody charges into superior numbers, and that moment was enough. Baker killed 2 more, dove behind a fallen log as return fire finally arrived, rolled left, and came up shooting at a different angle. 30, 31. A grenade landed near him. Baker saw it, scooped it up in a motion that was equal parts reflex and insanity, and threw it back toward its source. The explosion killed at least 2 more soldiers. Minute 6. 6. Baker's ammunition was running low. The rifle he was carrying had maybe 5 rounds left. He had one more grenade on his captured webbing. After that, it would be down to the sword and his knife, assuming he could find it among the dead, and his bare hands if necessary. A soldier tried to bayonet him from the side. Baker turned, parried the thrust with his rifle barrel, closed distance, and smashed the rifle butt into the man's face. The soldier dropped, and Baker took his ammunition pouches. 33. The clearing and surrounding jungle had become a charnel house. Bodies lying everywhere, blood soaking into the mud, the air thick with cordite smoke and the copper smell of spilled blood. The Japanese were down to perhaps 20 effectives, but 20 coordinated soldiers with cover and fields of fire could still end this. Baker knew he needed to break them psychologically, needed to make them fear him more than they feared dishonor or disobeying orders. He grabbed the dead officer's sword again. He dropped it somewhere and retrieved it twice more during the fighting and charged screaming into the nearest group of soldiers. The sheer insanity of the attack, a blood-covered American wielding a sword and roaring incoherently, broke something in the soldiers' morale. They fell back, firing wildly, and Baker killed 2 more in the confused melee. 35. 36. Minute 7. The end came not with a dramatic final confrontation, but with a sudden, almost eerie quiet. Baker found himself crouched behind a tree, his breathing loud in the sudden silence, and realized that for the first time in 6.5 minutes, nobody was shooting at him. He waited, every sense straining, the rifle in his hands tracking for targets. Seconds passed. No movement. No sounds except his own ragged breathing and the distant calls of birds that were cautiously returning to the area. Carefully, slowly, Baker moved through the clearing, rifle ready, checking bodies. Some were clearly dead. Others were wounded, groaning, reaching weakly for weapons they no longer had the strength to grasp. Baker didn't have the ammunition to spare for mercy killings, didn't have the time to secure prisoners, didn't have any capacity left for anything except confirming that the immediate threats were neutralized. He counted as he moved. 37, 40, 45, 51, 54. Every single Japanese soldier was down, dead or so badly wounded they were no longer threats. The execution detail had been annihilated. Baker stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the dead, his body shaking from adrenaline crash and exhaustion, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. 7 minutes. 54 armed, trained soldiers. One desperate American who'd refused to die. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel triumph. He felt nothing except the hollow exhaustion that comes after combat, the emotional numbness that follows extreme violence. He mechanically gathered ammunition from the dead, took a canteen and drank water that tasted like metal and blood, stripped usable equipment from bodies. Then, without looking back, Vernon Baker walked into the jungle, heading in the direction he hoped would take him toward American lines, leaving behind a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and that military historians would later analyze as one of the most improbable survival stories in combat history. The clearing looked like a battlefield that had hosted hours of intense combat rather than 7 minutes of desperate violence. Bodies lay in clusters and alone, in positions that told stories of how they died, rushing forward, trying to retreat, attempting to establish firing positions, caught in crossfire from their own comrades. Weapons lay scattered across the ground, some still gripped by dead hands, others abandoned when their owners realized that survival demanded flight rather than fight. Baker stood near the center of the killing ground, a stolen Japanese rifle in his hands, his entire body trembling with the after effects of combat adrenaline. His uniform was torn and soaked, blood, sweat, mud, all mixed together into a dark stain. He had wounds he was only now beginning to feel, the bayonet slice on his left forearm, a bullet graze across his ribs, multiple cuts and bruises from hand-to-hand combat, a gash on his forehead that was dripping blood into his eyes, but he was alive. Against all odds, against all probability, against the mathematical certainty that one man could not survive an execution by 54 soldiers, Vernon Baker was breathing, standing, capable of movement. The silence in the aftermath was profound and disturbing. Minutes ago, this clearing had been filled with gunfire, explosions, screaming, the terrible sounds of men killing and dying. Now there was only the soft whisper of wind through the jungle canopy, the distant call of birds cautiously returning, and Baker's own ragged breathing. He began the grim work of survival logistics. His captured rifle had 4 rounds remaining, not enough for another sustained engagement. He moved methodically through the dead, taking ammunition pouches, collecting grenades, finding a better weapon, a Japanese officer's Nambu pistol that appeared undamaged. He took a canteen, drank deeply despite the water tasting of metal and fear, took another, and slung it over his shoulder. His body was beginning to register its injuries now that the adrenaline was fading. The bayonet cut on his arm was deep enough to need stitches, probably probably would get infected in the jungle environment. The bullet graze across his ribs hurt with every breath. His hands were torn and bleeding from the fighting, and he suspected at least one finger was broken. It wouldn't bend properly and was swelling rapidly. But pain was irrelevant. Pain meant he was alive. Dead men didn't hurt. Baker forced himself to think tactically. This clearing was compromised. The gunfire would have been heard by any Japanese forces in the area, and they would send patrols to investigate. He needed to move, needed to put distance between himself and this killing ground, needed to find either American lines or a place to hide until he could navigate back to friendly territory. He checked the dead officer's map case, found a blood-stained map that showed the local area. His hands left red prints on the paper as he oriented himself, trying to match terrain features to the map's contours. American lines were roughly 6 miles northeast, 6 miles of enemy-held jungle, but doable if he moved carefully and avoided Japanese patrols. Before leaving, Baker did something that military regulations required and his conscience demanded. He collected dog tags from the dead, not from the Japanese soldiers. He had no way to carry 54 tags, and identification of enemy dead was not his responsibility. But if any American prisoners had been executed here before his arrival, if there were any remains that could be identified and returned to families, he wanted that information. He found nothing. This execution detail had apparently been assembled specifically for him, or he had been the first prisoner they'd planned to execute at this location. The knowledge was both relieving and disturbing. Relieving because it meant no other Americans had died here. Disturbing because it emphasized how close he'd come to being just another disappeared soldier. His fate unknown to anyone except the men who'd killed him. Baker took one final look around the clearing, his mind already beginning the process of compartmentalization that combat soldiers use to deal with extreme violence. He had killed 54 men in 7 minutes. Under any normal circumstances, this would be cause for psychological trauma, moral questioning, deep emotional processing. But these weren't normal circumstances. This was war at its most fundamental. Kill or be killed, survive or die, with no middle ground and no time for doubt. He had refused to die. Everything else was consequence. With the stolen rifle in his hands, captured ammunition on his webbing, and a compass bearing toward American lines fixed in his mind, Vernon Baker walked away from the clearing. Behind him, the dead lay where they'd fallen. Their execution ritual turned back on itself. Their certainty of victory transformed into their own annihilation. The jungle closed around him, swallowing him into green shadows and humid air. Somewhere ahead were American lines, safety, medical attention, debriefing, and questions he wasn't sure he could answer. Somewhere behind was a killing ground that defied explanation, a scene that would seem impossible to anyone who hadn't lived it. Baker moved through the jungle with the careful silence of a man who understands that survival is never guaranteed, that the next patrol could be around the next bend, that the war wasn't over just because he'd won one impossible battle. His body hurt, his mind was numb with exhaustion and shock, but his will to survive burned as fiercely as it had when he'd launched himself at the Japanese officer and made the first move in what would become 7 minutes of controlled chaos and desperate violence. He didn't know if he'd make it back to American lines, didn't know if infection would claim him before rescue did, didn't know if his story would be believed or dismissed as combat hallucination. He knew only that he was alive, moving, armed, and determined to stay that way. The jungle whispered around him, neither hostile nor friendly, simply present. And somewhere in its depths, one American soldier carried the weight of an impossible survival, walking toward safety or toward death, not knowing which, but refusing to stop moving. When combat historians and military psychologists examined Baker's survival, once the story finally emerged through post-war documentation and witness testimony, they struggled to reconcile the facts with statistical probability. By every reasonable metric, one soldier should not have survived combat against 54 enemies in confined terrain with no cover and no support. Yet it happened. The analysis of how reveals lessons about combat that transcend individual heroism and illuminate fundamental truths about human conflict. First, the psychology of shock and unexpected violence. The Japanese execution detail had assembled with specific expectations. They were performing a ritual they'd conducted before, following a script where the prisoner knelt, the officer struck or shot, and the condemned died. Their mental preparation was for ceremony, not combat. When Baker violated that script by attacking, their psychological framework collapsed. Human beings operate on pattern recognition. We prepare for expected scenarios and struggle when confronted with the unexpected. The Japanese soldiers expected submission, or perhaps a futile attempt to run. They did not expect an unarmed prisoner to attack his executioner, successfully kill him, arm himself, and immediately begin killing others. That violation of expectations created a crucial few seconds of paralysis, and in combat, seconds determine survival. Modern military training emphasizes the importance of the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Baker's attack compressed his own OODA loop to near instantaneous, while simultaneously disrupting his enemy's loops. They had to observe what was happening, orient their understanding to a completely unexpected situation, decide how to respond, and only then act. Baker was already acting while they were still observing. Second, the mathematics of confined combat. The clearing where the execution occurred measured approximately 30 feet across, surrounded by dense jungle vegetation. This terrain negated the Japanese numerical advantage in several critical ways. In open terrain, 54 soldiers can establish overlapping fields of fire, create multiple firing positions, and coordinate their attacks to overwhelm a single target. But in confined space with limited visibility, those 54 soldiers became obstacles to each other. They couldn't all fire simultaneously without risking fratricide. They couldn't maneuver freely because other soldiers blocked potential movement routes. They couldn't coordinate effectively because verbal orders were lost in the chaos of gunfire and screaming. Baker, positioned at the clearing's edge with jungle at his back, could use vegetation for cover while forcing the Japanese to approach through limited channels. This turned numerical superiority into a tactical liability. The Japanese soldiers couldn't bring their full force to bear simultaneously, while Baker could focus his fire on whoever presented the most immediate threat. Military theorists call this the funnel effect. When superior numbers are forced through narrow approaches, combat effectiveness decreases rather than increases. The Japanese execution detail fell victim to their own positioning, their ceremonial formation becoming a killing ground where their numbers worked against them. Third, the weapon of fear and momentum. After the initial killings, Baker maintained offensive momentum. He didn't try to defend a position or survive through evasion. He attacked constantly, aggressively, with such ferocity that the Japanese soldiers went from hunters to hunted in psychological terms. Fear is contagious in combat. When soldiers see their comrades falling rapidly, when death seems random and unstoppable, when the enemy appears unstoppable, panic can spread faster than bullets. The Japanese soldiers watched their officers die, watched their comrades fall, watched this American, who should have been dead minutes ago, continue fighting with what must have seemed like superhuman determination. Some military historians have compared Baker's survival to famous last stands like Thermopylae or the Alamo, except those battles ended in death for the defenders. Baker's situation was different because he maintained offensive action throughout. He never gave the Japanese soldiers time to organize, never allowed them to establish the psychological upper hand, never let them feel like they were winning despite their numerical advantage. Fourth, training and muscle memory. Baker was not an untrained soldier thrust into combat. He was an experienced infantryman who had drilled weapons handling, close combat, and tactical movement until they became automatic. When conscious thought shuts down under extreme stress, training takes over. His ability to strip weapons from dead soldiers, load and fire unfamiliar Japanese weapons, employ grenades effectively, and maintain target discipline while under fire. All of this came from hundreds of hours of training that had programmed his muscle memory. He didn't think about reloading. His hands did it automatically. He didn't consciously aim. His body oriented toward threats through trained reflexes. Modern combat psychology understands that under extreme stress, humans lose higher cognitive function and operate on trained responses. Baker's training was so thorough that even in the chaos of desperate combat, he executed fundamental infantry skills with lethal effectiveness.